Hello, how are you doing tonight? My name is Brant Hunt. My channel is Discerning What is True, and I'm on Facebook. I'm actually on YouTube, and I'm also on uh, Odyssey. So the day is the 9th day of January 2023. Some of the books I'll be going through here in the near future will be this particular book here, Anthony Sutton, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. Another book that I'll be going through is Technocracy Rising by Patrick Wood. And then we'll try to deal with this particular masterpiece that was done by Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death. All right, let's get to the meat of the book here. Um, with Diplomacy by Deception, we're going to be dealing with the fourth chapter of the book. This particular book chapter is dealing with what we call the Rockefeller, the evil genie. And I hope that all of you doing well tonight. Hope that you're having a good day or a good night, that is. So here we go. Rockefeller, the evil genie. Again, this work is being done by none other than, let's see, what's his, uh, okay, here we go. No other industry has been corrupted as the mighty, powerful petroleum industry. No other industry has as justly earned the epithets hurled against it when the American Indians led Father Joseph de la Rochelle d'Alentian, a French Franciscan missionary, to the mysterious pool of black water in western Pennsylvania. They could not imagine what horrible results would come from it. The oil industry has survived all attempts to breach its walls, whether by government or by private citizens. The U.S. oil industry has survived personal vendettas by the late Senator Henry Jackson and Frank Church, and had emerged from numerous investigations with a plumb and its secrets intact. Not even antitrust suits could break its power. Well, probably the reason why it couldn't break its power because there are many men who were not good men who were bought off by Rockefeller. That's my um, aim here, sharing with you. So the petroleum industry cannot be mentioned without naming John D. Rockefeller, who created Standard Oil of New Jersey. The Rockefeller name is also synonymous with greed and unwavering lust for power. The hatred, the majority of Americans feel for the Rockefeller started with the big hand surface in the Pennsylvania oil regions. It began among the descendants of the pioneer drillers who flocked to Titusville and Pitt Head when the Black Gold Rush was getting into its stride in 1865. Hold on just a second. John D. Rockefeller's ability to rob prospectors and drillers of their own oil claims is strangely reminiscent of the pioneer efforts of Cecil John Rhodes or Barry Barnato, Barnato, and other Rothschild Warburg agents who provided the money for a daylight robbery and chicanery practiced by those con artists on the Kimberly Diamond and the Rand Gold Claims owner. That's R-A&D. Nelson Rockefeller once claimed that the family fortune was an accident, but the facts speak otherwise. The paranoia and need for secrecy that surrounded John D. Rockefeller was handed down to his sons and adopted as a successful defense against outside prying into oil matters. Today, the Committee of 300, accounting firm of Price Waterhouse, does the accounts in such a way that even the best accountants in various Senate committees have not been able to unlock the Rockefeller finances. Such is the nature of the beast. The question is often asked, why was Rockefeller so profoundly crooked? One can only surmise that it was inherent in his nature. John D. Rockefeller did not believe in letting friendship stand in the way of his progress, and warned his sons never to let good fellowship get a hold of you. His favorite dogma concerned a wise old owl who said nothing and heard much. Early photographs of John D. shows a long, grim face, small eyes without a trace of any human qualities. In view of his appearance, it is all the more wondered that the Clark brothers allowed John D. in as their bookkeeper and then as a partner in their refinery. The brothers soon found out that Rockefeller was not to be trusted. In a short space of time, they were forced out, bought out, according to John D. That is Ida Tarbell's book, The History of Standard Oil Company. Maybe we'll read that book. That'd be an interesting book. This was done. I did that book. That'd be an excellent book to look into, which is rich with examples of Rockefeller's cast iron ruthlessness and its inhumanity to all except himself. The Standard Oil Company was the most secretly run company in the history of the United States, a tradition carried on by Exxon and its affiliates today. It is said that Standard Oil was bolted down, barricaded like a fortress. Rockefeller's image became so tarnished that he hired Ivy Lee, a public relations man, to help him make his image into one of a philanthropist. And you'll notice that I did not write, but actually read parts of the book called, so many books on my thing here. Let's see. Here it is. Propaganda last night, and it's mentioned it is Ivy League is another guy who is against competition that is with Bernays. But in spite of his best efforts, Lee was unable to remove the legacy of hatred left by John D. The tarnished image of Standard and the Rockefellers had carried over to the 1990s and will probably be there forever. Standard Oil was to be the standard bearer for the oil industry in its conduct towards nations with oil and gas reserves beneath their soil. The Rockefellers have always been a law unto themselves, and very early on they decided that the only way to escape taxation was to place the bulk of their funds and assets outside of the United States. Already by 1885, Rockefeller had established markets in Europe and the Far East, which accounted for a staggering 70% of Standard Oil business. But Rockefeller's march across the continents did not go unchallenged. Public resentment of Standard reached new heights, new levels after the writer like Ida Tarbell, I'll spell this for you, Ida Tarbell, Tarbell, and H.D. Lloyd exposed the fact that Standard was a company with an army of spies above local, state, and federal governments who had declared war, negotiated peace, reduced courts, legislation, and sovereign states to unequal obedience to its will. Anger and complaints poured into the Senate when the American people were told about the Standard monopoly practice, which resulted in the Sherman Antitrust Act, but so deliberately vague was the law, which left several issues unaddressed, that compliance was easily avoided by Rockefeller and his brute of lawyers. Yeah. Rockefeller once described it as an exercise in public relations with no teeth to it. Never was John D. Rockefeller influence in the Senate more keenly felt than during the Sherman antitrust debates. It was a time when the individual senators were subjected to great pressure by Rockefeller's lobbyists. Rockefeller suffered a temporary setback when in May of 1911, when Chief Justice Edward White handed down his decision on an antitrust case brought against Standard by Frank Kellogg. Standard was to shed all of its subsidies within 6 months. Rockefeller responded by employing an army of writers to explain that the special nature of the oil trade did not lend itself to normal business methods. It had to be treated as a special entity, to be handled just as John D. Rockefeller had done. To dilute Judge White's ruling, Rockefeller set up his own form of government. The new government took the form of foundations and philanthropy institutions, modeled after the Patriot system of the royal courts of Europe. These institutions and foundations would shield the Rockefeller fortune from income tax, which his paid hirings in Senate had warned him would be coming in the years ahead. This was the beginning of the petroleum industry government within government, power which is still in place today. No doubt the CFR, Council for Foreign Relations, owes its rapid rise to power to Rockefeller and Harry Pratt. In 1914, a member of the Senate called Rockefeller's empire the secret government of the United States. Rockefeller's strategists called for a private intelligence agency and followed their advice. Rockefeller literally bought the personal and equipment of Reinhard Heydrich SS intelligence service, which today is known as Interpol, which is Interpolice. Interesting. With intelligence likened to the best of Heydrich's SS intelligence behind them, the Rockefellers were able to infiltrate countries, first to take over their governments, change their tax laws and foreign policies, and then pressure the U.S. government to fall in. If taxation laws became tougher, the Rockefellers would simply get the law changed. It is this Bacchus Basilius in the oil industry that closed out local production that would have made America totally independent of foreign oil. The net result was higher prices for the American consumer and obscene profits for the oil companies. The Rockefellers were soon on the scene in the Middle East, but their efforts to gain concessions were blocked by Harry F. Sinclair. It seems that Sinclair was able to bin out the Rockefellers at every turn. Then came a dramatic reversal, the Teapot Dome scandal, in which Sinclair's close friend, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall, and Fall's friend Mahoney were indicted for grabbing the Teapot Dome and Elks Hill naval oil reserves for private gain. There were many who voiced concern that the Teapot Dome scandal was set up by the Rockefellers to discredit and remove Sinclair as an unwelcome competitor. The scandal shook Washington and cost Fall his job, the origins of the term Fall Guy. Sinclair was barely able to stay out of prison. All his lucrative contracts with Persia, Russia were canceled. To this day, it is widely suspected but not proved that the Teapot Dome scandal was a Rockefeller sting operation. Eventually, most of Sinclair's concessions in the Middle East, with the exception of those held by Britain, passed into Rockefeller's hand. Events in Iran were soon to prove the power of Rockefeller and his British associates. In 1941, when Reza Shah Pahlavi of Iran refused to join the so-called Allies against Germany and expelled its nationals from the country, Churchill flew into a rage and thereupon ordered an invasion of Iraq, in which he was joined by the Bolshevik Russian allies. By permitting Russian troops to enter Iran, Churchill opened the door to Russian presence in the region, one of Stalin's long-for goals. See, Churchill's an idiot, folks. He wasn't an idiot. He was one of them. That's what he was. He was one of them, a communist, socialist. This was a shocking betrayal of the Iranian people and the West in general, and showed that the Rockefeller influence was international. Such is the power of the petroleum companies, especially those controlled by the Rockefellers. The representatives of Standard Oil and Royal Dutch Shell Oil companies advised Churchill to arrest and expel Reza Shah, which he promptly did, sending him first to Mauritius and then to South Africa, where he died in exile. You don't tell you all this stuff, folks. They just don't. Documents I examined in the British Museum in London showed extensive intervention by the Rockefellers in Mideast politics. In the British Parliament, Churchill crowed, "We," that is the oil companies, "have just chased the dictator into exile and installed a constitutional government pledge to a whole catalog of serious-minded reforms." What he did not say was that the constitutional government was a puppet government selected by the oil companies, and the whole catalog of reforms was for the sole purpose of further entrenching American and British oil industries' interests to get even bigger cuts of oil revenue. By 1951, the nationalist moves sweeping the Middle East, which had begun in Egypt, where Colonel Gamal Nasser was bent on ousting the British from control of the country, spread to Iran as well. As the time, a genuine Iranian patriot, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, emerged to challenge Churchill's puppet government. Mossadegh's main thrust was to break the power of the foreign oil companies. He judged the move of the Iranian people as right for such a move. This deeply alarmed the Rockefellers, who appealed to Britain for help. Mossadegh told Rockefeller and British Petroleum that he would not abide by their concession agreements. David Rockefeller is said to have developed a personal hatred of Mossadegh because of this. British Petroleum appealed to the British government to put an end to the nuisance Mossadegh was creating. Churchill, eager to comply with the demands of the Seven Sisters oil cartel, made of the 7 major British and American oil companies in the Middle East, asked for U.S. for help. A talented, well-educated, astute politician from a wealthy background, Mossadegh desire to help the Iranian people benefit from their national resource was genuine. In May of '51, that is, Dr. Mossadegh nationalized Iranian oil. An international advertisement campaign was launched against Mossadegh, who was depleted, a silly little man running around Tehran in his pajamas. They always make fun of people, folks. And the West just, laps it up. They believe this bullshit. In Invested Emotions, this was far from the truth. Led by the Rockefeller oil companies and backed by the U.S. State Department, an international boycott of Iranian oil was ordered. Iranian oil soon became unsellable. The State Department declared its support for Churchill's puppet government in Tehran, which was installed when the Shah refused to join the Allies in the war against Germany. At the same time, the CIA and MI6 launched a joint operation against Mossadegh. It was codenamed Operation Ajax. What followed was a classic example of how governments are subverted and toppled through diplomacy by deception. Churchill, who had lost the election after the war ended, was returning to power by a thoroughly brainwashed British public. He used his office to wage war against Dr. Mossadegh and the Iranian people through highwaymen and pirate taxes, as the following example shows. So they're going to try to get rid of them, and they're eventually going to. Okay, but this is what I'm going to explain to you right here. Multinational corporations are more powerful than countries, folks. They are. I learned this back in the 1980s. So just continue on here. The Rose Marie, which sailed this international waters carrying Iranian oil, was not in breach of any international laws or treaties when it was ordered by Churchill to be intercepted by the Royal Air Force and was forced to sail for Aden, a port under British control. The hijacking of a ship at sea had the full backing of the U.S. State Department and the Rockefeller family suggestion. My source in London, whose job it is to monitor the oil industry, told me in 1970 that Churchill was restrained by his cabinet only with a difficulty from ordering the RAF to bomb the Rose Marie. A year passed in which Iran suffered great financial losses. In 1953, Dr. Mossadegh wrote to President Dwight asking for help. He might as well have written to Rockefellers. Eisenhower, playing the game of nerves, did not respond. Yeah, he was one of those too. The tactics had the desired effect of frightening Mossadegh. Finally, Eisenhower did reply in the classic style of diplomacy by deception, advised the Iranian leader to abide by Iran's international obligations. Mossadegh continued to defy both the British and American governments. The oil companies sent a deputation to see Eisenhower to ask that immediate measures be taken to remove Mossadegh. Kermit Roosevelt, who headed the CIA covert operation against Mossadegh. By the way, Kermit Roosevelt is a Roosevelt. He was a family member of the Roosevelt government at that time, who was a very bad guy who actually run the CIA. It's amazing what a family can do, isn't it? It's just amazing. I guess we're tireless to establish forces inside Tehran that could be used to cause unrest. Large sums of money said by sources to have amounted to $303 million changed hands. It was $3 million back then, was pretty big money. In April of 1953, Shah Mohammad Reza, under intense pressure from the international backers, tried to dismiss Dr. Mossadegh, but the attempt failed. The CIA and MI6 equipped armies of agents started to attack the military. Fearing assassination, the Shah fled, and Mossadegh was toppled in August of 1953. The cost to American taxpayers was probably nearly $10 million. It is worth noting there that while Kermit Roosevelt was preparing the CIA covert operation against Dr. Mossadegh in '51, his Rockefeller partners were facing judicial proceedings in Washington that should have caused a halt to operations in Iran. The fact is that the all-powerful petroleum industry knew it could beat back the challenge as it had done with all others. Justice Department proceedings were launched against Exxon, Texaco, Standard, Gulf, Mobil, and SoCal. No effort was made to go after Shell and BP. Standard Oil immediately commissioned, that is, Dean Acheson, to blunt the inquiry. Acheson proved a good example of how Rockefeller used important people in government and the private sector to override the government of Washington. Early in 1952, Acheson went on to the attack, citing the interests of the State Department in protecting American foreign policy initiative, thereby tactfully admitting that the major oil companies were running the state foreign policy. You see, Acheson demanding that the investigation be shelved in the interest of not weakening our good relations in the Near East. Acheson failed to mention the uproar and instability being created at this very moment in Iran by Rockefeller, the CIA, and the MI6. The Attorney General responded with a sharply worded attack on the oil monopolies. Okay, here we go again. Warning that the petroleum should be fixed or freed from the grip of a few. Free enterprise can only be preserved by safeguarding it from excess of power, both government and private. He then accused the cartel of acting in a way to endanger national security. Rockefeller immediately ordered that damage control efforts put in place through his contacts inside the State and Justice Department. To this day, both are infested with CFR Rockefeller agents. Acheson publicly denounced the investigation as an action by police dogs from the antitrust who want no truck with Mammoth and the unrighteous. His tone of voice was at all times belligerent and threatening. Acheson lined up support for Rockefeller from the Defense and Interior Department, who vouched for the Seven Sisters in a most astounding manner. The companies, the major oil companies that is, played a vital role in supplying the free world most essential commodity. American oil operations are for all practical purposes instruments of our foreign policy. Dean Acheson then attempted to raise the boogeyman of Soviet interference in the Middle East, which was nothing more than a red herring to distract attention away from how the oil companies operated. Eventually, all criminal charges against the cartel were dropped. To show their utter contempt for U.S. law, the representatives of the major oil companies met in London in 1924 to avoid possible conspiracy charges at the request of Sir William Fraser. A letter that Fraser wrote to the top executives of Standard, Mobil, Texaco, BP, SoCal, and Shell said that they needed to meet in order to settle accounts with a now thoroughly aroused Shah Pahlavi. The conspiracy met again in London 1 month later, where they were joined by the CEO. I don't think that's 24, folks. I think that's 1954. I think that's right. It's a misprint, looks like here in the book, because that's what's going on. The conspiracy met again in London 1 month later, where they were joined by the CEO of the French company, Francisco de Petroleons. Agreement was reached to form a consortium that would control the Iranian oil. The new body was called a consortium, as the use of the word cartel in America was deemed to be injusticity. Success was guaranteed. American executives told their foreign counterparts because the State Department had given their blessing to the London meeting. As far as the State Department was concerned, the Seven Sisters played a key role in the Middle East in fending off communism penetration in an area of vital control to the United States, given the fact that in 1942, the very same oil companies backed Churchill in bringing Soviet Bolshevik troops to invade Iran, thereby giving Stalin his greatest opportunity to get a foothold in the Middle East. That was not exactly the truth. Throughout the Justice Department proceedings, which began in October '51, State Department registrars kept referring to the petroleum industry as a so-called cartel. The State Department is densely populated with Rockefeller agents, perhaps more so than any other government institution which David Rockefeller had controls. It remains my firm conviction to this day that a way has not yet been found to break the Rockefeller chains that bind the oil companies in this nation to the Council on Foreign Relations, which controls every facet of our foreign policy towards the oil nations of the world. It is a situation that we, the people, will have to confront, hopefully sooner rather than later. In Washington, civil proceedings against the petroleum cartel fizzed out in the face of threats by the Council on Foreign Relations, which was backed by its puppet, that is, President Eisenhower. Eisenhower said that the national security interests of the United States were being threatened by the proceedings. CFR, CFR puppet, that is, Eisenhower, instructed his Attorney General Herbert Browner Jr. to tell the court that the antitrust laws must be deemed secondary to the national security interests. Wow. Yeah, he was in there. He was in their hands for sure. While Kermit Roosevelt was going at it hammer and tongues in Tehran, Eisenhower and Dulles offered the court a compromise that would, in Eisenhower's words, protect the interests of the free world in the Near East as a major source of petroleum supplies. No wonder that the Ayatollah Khomeini decades later would call the United States the Great Satan. Khomeini was not referring to the people in the United States, but to their government. Khomeini knew full well that the ordinary Americans were the victim of conspiracies, that they were lied to, cheated, robbed, and forced to sacrifice the blood of millions of their sons in foreign wars in which they had absolutely no reason to take part. Khomeini, avid student of history, knew all about the Federal Reserve Act, which he said kept the people in the grips of slavery. When the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was seized by the Revolutionary Guards, several compromising documents fell into Khomeini's hands, which clearly showed the CIA's involvement with British Petroleum, Standard, and other major oil companies. Once the coup was declared a success, the Shah returned to his palace. Little did he know that 2 decades later he would suffer the same fate as Mossadegh. As the hands of the petroleum industry and his surrogate government in Washington and London, CIA and MI6, the Shah, though he thought he could trust David Rocco, but like many others, it was not long before he realized his trust was sadly misplaced. Having access to the documents Mossadegh had dug up, which showed the extent of the plunging of the Iranian natural resources, the Shah quickly became disenchanted with London and Washington. Upon hearing the news of revolts in Mexico and Venezuela against the Rockefellers and Shell, coupled with the news about Saudi Arabia golden gimmick, the Shah began to pressure Rockefeller and the British for a larger share of the Iranian oil revenues, which at that time amounted to only 30% of the total amount of oil revenues enjoyed by the oil companies. Other companies had felt the lash of the petroleum industry as well. Mexico is a classic case of petroleum companies' foreign policy making abilities, which transcend national boundaries and cost American consumers a huge fortune. Oil, it seemed, was the foundation of a new economic order with undisputed power in the hands of a few people hardly known outside of the petroleum industry. The majors have been referred to as a number of times. This is a shorthand for the major oil companies that from the most successful cartel in the history of commerce, Exxon called Esso, that is in Europe, which it was also called Esso here in America when I was a kid. Shell, BP, Gulf, Texaco, Mobil, and SoCal, now Chevron. Together, they form part of a major network of interfacing banks, insurance companies, and brokerage houses controlled by the Committee of 300, which are hardly known outside their circles. The reality of the one world government or new world order, upper level of government brooks no interference from anyone, no matter who it might be, even powerful national governments to rulers of nations great and small, corporations of private people. These supernatural giants have expertise in accounting methods that have fooled the best brains in government, out of whose reach they remain. Through diplomacy by deception, it seems the majors were able to induce governments to parcel out oil concessions to them. No matter who opposed it, John D. Rockefeller would very much have approved this closed shop, run for the last 68 years by Exxon and Shell. It is evident from the vastness and complexity of these operations, most often carried out like clockwork, and often involve activities in several countries at one time, that the petroleum industry is one of the most powerful components that make up the economic operations of the Committee of 300. In secret, the Seven Sisters Club has plotted wars and decided among themselves which governments must bow to their depredations, which, when trouble arises, such as in the case of Dr. Mossadegh and later President Saddam Hussein of Iraq, It's only a matter of calling upon the right Air Force, Navy, Army, Intelligence Service to solve the problem and get rid of the nuisance. It can be no more trouble than swatting a fly. The Seven Sisters became a government within a government, and nowhere is this more the case than the Rockefeller Standard Oil, along with SoCal, Exxon, and Chevron. If one would like to know American British foreign policies for Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Iraq, one needs only study the policies of BP, which is British Petroleum, Exxon, Gulf Oil, and Aramco. What is our policy in Angola? Is it to protect Gulf oil properties in that country? You know, it means supporting a avowed Marxist government. This was also back in the 1980s too, when the Cubans were there and the South Africans were fighting, and I think some U.S. troops were there also. I think those U.S. troops were volunteers though. Who would have imagined that Gulf, Exxon, Chevron, and Aramco had more say about American foreign affairs than members of Congress? Indeed, who would imagine that? Standard Oil would one day control the foreign policy of the United States and have the State Department acting as it run for its own economic benefit. In other words, they just pay people, pay them out, give them what they want. Doesn't matter to them. You see, you don't have people who are what I call have any guts, but it's not just guts, have any standards or foundation. Continue. They know they can buy people out. That's what the problem is. Is any other group so exalted, so favored with showers of tax concession that run into billions of dollars per annum? I am often asked, why is it that the American domestic petroleum industry, once so bustling and full of promise, went into a steep decline? The answer in one word is greed. For this reason, domestic production of oil has to be curtailed in case the public should ever discover what was going on. Yeah, we have plenty of oil here, folks. We do. Plenty of domestic oil. No doubt about it. Okay? This knowledge is much more difficult to attain when dealing with foreign operations. What does the American public know about what goes on in the oil policies of Saudi Arabia? Even while making record profits, the petroleum industry demands and gets additional tax breaks, both open and hidden from public view. Here, the citizens of the United States benefit from the huge profits made by Exxon, Texaco, Chevron, and Mobil before it was sold. The answer is no, because most of the profit was made upstream, that is, outside the United States, which is where the profits were kept, while the U.S. consumer paid ever-rising prices for gas at the pumps. My understanding simply is that the United States is now importing gasoline, not oil, but gasoline from other countries because simply we don't have the refinery capacity. And I believe that's done on purpose, again, for them to benefit. So we don't have that many refineries here. And it's done simply as we bring in gasoline, so it's already been refined. But the key is simply is it's going to cost more. And it's going to be dealt with easier if it was done here. But this is a trick they're doing, as far as I can tell. Rockefeller's main area of concern became Saudi Arabia. The oil companies, by various stratagems, had entrenched themselves with King Ibn Saud. The king worried that Israel would one day threaten his country and strengthen the Israel lobby in Washington, needing something that would give him an edge. The State Department, at the urging of the Rockefellers, said it could only follow a pro-Saudi policy without upsetting Israel by using Exxon, which is Aramco, as a front. This information was given to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It was so sensitive that committee staffers were not even allowed to see it. Rockefeller had in fact paid only a small fee, that is $500,000, to secure a major oil concession from Ibn Saud. After considerable diplomacy, deception was worked out. Deception which cost American taxpayers at least $50 million its first year. You see, what came out of the discussion between Exxon and Ibn Saud is known as the golden gimmick. In the inner sanctum of the Rockefeller boardrooms, the American oil companies agreed to pay a subsidy to the Saudi ruler of not less than $50 million a year, based on the amount of Saudi oil pumped. The State Department would then allow the American companies to declare such subsidy payments foreign income tax, which Rockefeller, for example, could deduct from Exxon U.S. taxes. You see how this game goes, folks? With production of cheap Saudi oil soaring, so did the subsidies payments soar. This is one of the greatest scams perpetrated upon the American people. The bottom line of the plan was that huge foreign aid payments were made annually to the Saudis under the guise of subsidies. When the Israeli government uncovered the scheme, it too demanded subsidies, which today amount to $13 billion per year, all at the expense of American taxpayers. Now, remember, this book is older, folks, so it's more than that now, for sure. Somebody is playing the United States. Not only is Israel, but also Saudi Arabia, and also Rockefeller's oil companies. Since the American consumer actually helps pay for cheaper imported crude oil than domestic crude oil, shouldn't we benefit from this arrangement through cheaper gasoline prices to pump? After all, Saudi oil was so cheap, and in view of the production subsidies, wouldn't this translate into lower gasoline prices to pump? Does the American consumer derive the slightest benefit from footing the huge bill? No way. Apart from geopolitical considerations, the majors are also guilty of price fixing. The cheap Arab oil, for instance, was fixed at a higher domestic crude oil price when imported into the United States by subterfuge known as phantom freight rates. According to hard evidence presented to the multinational hearing in 1975, the major oil companies led by Rockefeller's companies made 70% of their profits abroad, profits which could not be taxed at the time. You see, that's why they're not exploring oil here in this country at all. You see, they're bringing it in. When the bulk of their profits coming from upstream, the petroleum industry was not about to make a major investment in the domestic oil industry. Of course not. Why should they? You see, as a consequence, the domestic oil industry began to decline. Yes. Why spend money on the exploration and the exploitation of domestic oil when it was theirs for the asking of Saudi Arabia at a cheaper price than the local product and for a better, bigger profit for them? The unsuspecting American consumer was and is being shafted without knowing it, according to secret economic data, which a contact of mine who is still in the economic intelligence monitoring business showed me. Gas at the pumps in America, given all levels, state, federal prices, piled in the price, should not have cost the consumer more than 35 cents per gallon by the end of 1991. Yet we know that price pumps were there 3 to 5 times greater without any justification for such excessive high prices. The immorality of this gross deception is that had the big oil companies, and again, I must emphasize the leadership of the Rockefellers, and this not being so greedy, it could have produced domestic oil, which would have made our gasoline prices cheapest in the world. In my opinion, the manner in which this diplomatic deception was set up between the State Department and Saudi Arabia makes the State Department a partner to criminal enterprise, where in order not to have a falling out with Israel and at the same time keep the Saudis happy, the American consumers were loaded with a huge tax burden from which this country derived absolutely no benefit. Isn't that tantamount to the involuntary servitude forbidden by the U.S. Constitution? Yeah, very much so. You see, very much so. The rulers of Saudi Arabia then demanded that fixed prices be posted by the oil companies, that is Aramco, meaning that the country would not suffer a decline in the income and prices for oil drop. When they heard of the arrangements, Iran and Iraq demanded to receive the same fixed pricing agreement. The bottom line here is that the oil companies, led by the Rockefeller companies, pay taxes on an artificial higher price, not the real market price, which was offset by lower taxes that were paid in the United States, a major benefit not enjoyed by any other industry in America. This made it possible for Exxon and Mobil and all the Aramco companies to pay an average tax rate of 5%, notwithstanding the huge profits that they were making. Not only were the oil companies gouging the American consumer, and still are, but they are also making and carrying out U.S. foreign policy to the extreme detriment of the American people. Yeah. This is blackmail, folks. These arrangements and actions place the petroleum industry above the law, giving it a position from where the companies can and do dictate foreign policy to the elected government, free of any control by our representatives in Washington. The policies of the petroleum companies cost the American people billions of dollars in additional taxation and billions of dollars in excess profits at the pumps. The petroleum industry, and its particular Exxon, has no fear of the U.S. government, thanks to the control exercised by the permanent upper-level parallel secret government of the Council of Foreign Relations. Rockefeller is untouchable. That enabled Aramco to sell oil to the French Navy at 95 cents per barrel, while at the same time, the U.S. Navy was charged $1.43 per barrel. One of the few in the Senate who dared to tackle the awesome power of the Rockefellers was Senator Brewster. He discovered some of the slippery conduct of the petroleum industry during hearings in 1948, accusing the industry of bad faith with an variance desire for enormous profits, while at the same time constantly seeking to cloak of United States protection and assistance to preserve their vast concessions. The Rockefellers drafted a memo signed by the bigger U.S. oil companies, the gist of which was that they did not owe any special obligation to the United States. Rockefeller blatantly internationalism was finally flaunt for all to see. He didn't give a damn. All he cared about was money. All he cared about is greed, folks. That's all he cares about. As an example of the foregoing, M.J. Eaton, in an article published by the oil industry, stated the oil industry is at present confronted with the question of government control when the U.S. government invited the American Petroleum Industry Institute to name 3 members to the committee it has set up to consider conservation legislation. API's President E.W. Clark said, we cannot undertake to pass upon, still less accede to, any suggestion that the federal government may directly regulate the production of crude oil in several states. I think this is the American Petroleum Institute industry. I think it is what it stands for. Argued that the federal government did not have authority to control oil companies under Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. On May 27, 1927, the API said the government could not tell the industry what to do, even where the common defense and general welfare of the nation was concerned. Well, one of the best and most far-reaching exposés of the petroleum industry is a 400-page report entitled The International Petroleum Cartel. This great report has disappeared from view. It is my understanding that Rockefeller and CFR bought up every available copy shortly after it was published and preventing any more copies of the report from being printed. Inspired by the late John Sparkman and put together by Professor M. Blair, the history of the petroleum cartel was traced back to conspiracy that took place at, I don't know how to spell it, I'm pronounce it here, it's ACHNACARRY Castle, a remote fishing preserve in Scotland. Sparkman pulled no punches in a slashing attack on Rockefeller's oil empire. Professor Blair meticulously built a case which proved that the major oil companies had entered in a conspiracy to achieve the following goals. Number 1, to control all oil production in foreign countries insofar as production, sale, and distribution of oil was concerned. 2, to strictly control all technology and patents related to oil production and refining. 3, to share pipeline and tankers between the 7 sisters. 4, to share world markets among themselves only. So it's a cartel. That's what it is. They're not allowing any other competition in. 5, to act jointly to maintain artificial high prices for oil and gasoline. Professor Blair charged that particularly Aramco had been guilty of keeping oil prices at a high level where it was getting salty oil at an incredible low price. In response to Sparkman's charge, the Justice Department began its own investigation in 1951, which was dealt with earlier herein. Nothing has changed. The Gulf War is a good example of business as usual. The occupation of Somalia also has oil overtones, thanks to our newest spy satellite, the Cross Imager, which can relay images of what lies underground. Very substantial oil and gas reserves were detected in Somalia about 3 years ago. The find was kept absolutely secret. This led to the U.S. mission ostensibly to feed starving Somalian children shown on television night after night for 3 months. Wow, this is amazing. This is fucking amazing. A starving children rescue mission was staged by the Bush administration as a means of providing protection for Aramco, Phillips, Conoco, I don't know who this company is, Conoco, and British Petroleum Drilling Corporations coming under threat from Somalian leaders who were becoming aware that they were about to be plundered. This is why your soldiers go out there and fight for stupid things, folks. They're not fighting for any freedom at all. They're fighting for oil. They're dying for oil because our government and these people who do this stuff to us. All you got to do is wake up. That's all you got to do. American operation had little to do with feeding starving children. Why didn't the U.S. mount a similar rescue mission in Ethiopia, where starvation is a real problem? Obviously, the answer is that Ethiopia does not have any known oil reserves, you see. However, securing the port at Berbera is the chief goal of U.S. forces. There's a great discord in Russia over oil. The Kurds will have to suffer again and again over Mosul oil. Rockefeller and BP are still the greedy oil grabbers they always were. That's the conclusion of chapter 4, diplomacy by deception. So we're going to let this go. Hope everyone's doing well. So this is how they do it. It's amazing, isn't it? And you're told that your soldiers going in and they're fighting for freedom or trying to save somebody. It's all bull crap. It's all bull crap. The interesting thing now is interesting we could ever find out what really has occurred in Libya when the British and Americans bombed that country also, because there was Libyan oil. And I gather simply is that we've stolen it, either the United States or Britain. They stole that oil from the people because it was rightfully theirs. But we made him as a boogeyman too. That's what they do to you people. They tell you these people are bad people, when actually a lot of these guys are trying to help their own countries, their third world countries, to make it. And actually, Gaddafi was doing that. He had already built water. He discovered water in the deserts and was able to pump that, and they would have to be dependent upon water, you see. So he's always was working to help people out in the infrastructure. He was also, they were being paid, they were getting free education. And also, they were also getting free homes. His government was all looking out for the people. And yet, our government said he was a bad man. You see, it's amazing. But you know, greed is something else, something else. So that's my conclusion tonight with diplomacy by deception. Again, John Coleman is a great researcher. He's done this. I don't know if he's living or not. I really don't. I've looked up his name on Wikipedia, and I can't find anything. I don't know where he's at. He may have simply gone somewhere underground. I don't know. Or he may be dead. But it would be interesting if he was alive. But anyway, I wanted to tell you thank you for being here. And hopefully you'll learn something and discover how more bad things happen in this country because of crookedness. Not only just in this country, folks, but everywhere on this planet. Everywhere. So have a good night, and you take care.